Alright, hey everybody, we're back. So we just got done looking at the different categories of existence and looking, just barely scratching the surface on the discipline of ontology and talking about the potential existence of a necessary being. And so now we're going to jump straight into Anselm and look at how Anselm tries to show that there is such thing as a logically necessary being and that that being is God. Um, so we'll jump right in. What I'm going to try and do here is outline Anselm's argument in what's called a syllogistic form, which is sort of like a philosophical math problem. Just like you've got 2 plus 2 equals 4. So with a syllogism, you have a premise plus a premise equals a conclusion. And it's a way of logically arriving at a conclusion and breaking an argument down to see how the parts fit together. So let's go ahead and do that with Anselm's argument. I'll outline it first. Anselm describes God as the greatest conceivable being, or as he says it in the article, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. God is the greatest thing you can think of. That's the first premise of the argument. Second, existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind. Now, when he says existence in reality, he means exists in the real world. When he says existence in the mind, he means something that is imaginary. It exists up here, but not out in the real world. And when he says greater, existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind. He's saying it's better than, it's superior to. It's sort of a key word in Anselm's argument. Now, so that's 1, God is the greatest conceivable being. 2, existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind. 3, we know that God at least exists in the mind because we can conceive of this God, this greatest conceivable being, this deity. So that's third. Fourth, if, and this is where I'm going to slow it down because you'll need to follow me here. Okay. If the greatest conceivable being exists only in the mind, and if existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind, then the greatest conceivable being that exists only in the mind is not the greatest conceivable being, because a being greater than the greatest conceivable being can be conceived. Okay, if I just made your head explode, feel free to take a minute to reach down and sort of mop up all the blood and the brains everywhere. It's okay. It happens to everybody the first time they hear this. Anselm is trying to describe a logical contradiction here, because Anselm is conceiving of God as the greatest conceivable being, and existence in reality is greater than existence only in the mind. We know that God at least exists in the mind. We can imagine this being, but if we try to say, well, but this greatest conceivable being does not exist in reality, it only exists in the mind, well, if you can conceive of the greatest conceivable being existing in the mind, but existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind, and you can conceive that the greatest conceivable being could exist in reality, then you can conceive of a being that is greater than the greatest conceivable being that exists only in the mind. So therefore, the greatest conceivable being is the one that exists in reality, not just in the mind, not the imaginary one, it's the real one. And that is how Anselm arrives at his argument. So therefore, he says the greatest conceivable being, that's God, must exist in reality as well as in the mind. Again, because if the greatest conceivable being exists only in the mind, and existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind, then a being greater than the greatest conceivable being can be conceived, and that is a logical contradiction. And Anselm says, so here, God is a logically necessary being, according to Anselm. If anyone tries to say that God doesn't exist, or the greatest conceivable being doesn't exist, well, Anselm is arguing, well, they're contradicting themselves. So that's an outline of Anselm's argument that I hope helps you as you read his article. There are several objections that exist from I think I'll focus mainly on the objection made by Immanuel Kant in your readings. Um, Kant takes issue with the way that Anselm and others use the word existence in the ontological argument. And his famous phrase is that existence is not a predicate. Now, you've probably heard that word predicate before in English class, where you know a sentence that has a subject and a predicate, right? So, Bob is tall. Bob is the subject of that sentence. Is tall is the predicate. The predicate adds something to its subject. It tells us something about Bob. So we state our subject Bob, and then the predicate is tall. Well, now we have a little bit more information about Bob. Bob went to the store. Well, we know about something that Bob did. Something's been added to it. But what Kant says is that when we state a subject, we imply its existence already. And so, if a predicate is supposed to add something to a subject, then once we stated the subject, if we're treating existence like a regular predicate, then to say something like Bob exists, well, we're not saying anything new about Bob. We're just restating what we've already said. So we would say Bob exists. It's a redundancy. Likewise, if we were going to try and say Bob does not exist, well, then we've just contradicted ourselves. We've implied the existence of something and then denied the existence of something. And but we know that when we say things like horses exist, we're not being redundant. And when we say that unicorns do not exist, we're not being contradictory. And so what Kant is arguing is that, well, the word existence and the verb to exist is not a predicate in the same way that other predicates would be. So in the same way that tall would be. So Bob is tall, or Bob went to the store. Those are predicates in a different way. A more proper way to say that from Kant's point of view in a philosophical sense is rather than saying God exists or God does not exist, would be to try and say, all right, the concept of God applies to an object that we can observe in the world. Or we could say the concept of God does not apply to an object that we can observe in the world. We can already do that with our other example. So we can say the concept of a horse applies to an object that we can see in the world. We can drive around in the country, look at farms, and see horses on these farms. It's pretty normal. Likewise, we can also say that the concept of a unicorn does not apply to an object in the world. So when we drive around in the forest or in farms in the country around, you won't see a unicorn there. The only places you really see unicorns is in Hollywood through all their fancy special effects. But as far as we can tell, no real unicorns exist. This presents a particular problem with God, because God is what Immanuel Kant calls an object of pure thought. So we can't establish God's existence by going outside and looking around, and we can't do it by sort of pointing and saying, hey, God is sitting over there and at that table over here at Denny's. God can't be observed in the same way, and so that presents a problem. Essentially what it means is that God's existence can't be proved, according to Kant. Here you have Anselm presenting the argument and Kant presenting an objection to the argument. And I hope this helps bring some of these ideas down to earth and makes them a little easier to understand. So next we're going to be moving on to the cosmological argument, which I will cover in the next video. Alright, so we will see you there.